Welcome, everyone, to the Center for Threat-Informed Defense's four-part series on threat modeling, where we dive into the threat modeling process by answering four key questions. I'm Tiffany Bergeron with the Center for Threat-Informed Defense, which is CTID. And joining us on this series is Adam Shostak. He is a leading expert on threat modeling, who's written some of the most popular books on the subject and offers several training courses. He's also one of the creators of the four questions that we've been discussing. This is question 2. And we covered question 1 in the first series, which is what are we working on? Today we're going to talk about question 2, which is what could go wrong. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you.
All right, so we're here today to talk about what could go wrong. This is aligned to the four questions that we use when we talk about threat modeling, really for any system and for any organization. And question 2 deals with identifying and prioritizing threats to what we defined in question 1, to the systems or assets we identified in question 1. And we're also adding that layer of using MITRE ATT&CK as the language for discussing these threats. Would you like to share with us a little bit more on question 2, please?
Sure. Let me set the context for the question of what can go wrong by saying that a lot of people like to argue what is a threat. And by the way, I'm using this word threat to mean the promise of future violence. It threatened to rain, threatened to beat me up if I didn't give him my lunch money. And there's other ways we use the term threat, right? We use it to mean a threat actor.
Mm-hmm.
The malware community uses the term threat to refer to a piece of malware. But in threat modeling, I like to focus on every answer to the question of what can go wrong, because it's important to think about, and threat modeling, as we talked about last time, gives us a time to do that. And you and I, as experts, can look at a system and say, what could go wrong, and rattle stuff off. And as we go from this being about us to this being about scalable systems and teaching people consistent methods, tools, including, and I'm going to talk about ATT&CK in just a second, but let me talk about STRIDE first, because I think of STRIDE as the first of the really structured ways to think about the question of what can go wrong. It's a mnemonic. It stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and expansion of authority. And those 6 threats, those 6 things that can go wrong, give us a way to think about a diagram, a system, and answer it.
Mm-hmm.
And at MITRE, you've created ATT&CK, and both yourselves and I have come to different ways to use it as we actually think about threat modeling.
Mm-hmm.
And, as we were talking after you published your white paper, we learned that you and I, and this is a plural you, that your use was influenced by your assembling systems up out of components and making those work. And that led to a different interpretation. And this is so cool. This is so cool. That the same framework for thinking about tactics, techniques, and procedures can be used in 2 different analytic ways sort of blows my mind. And so I think that's really what we want to talk about today.
Excellent. Yes, and thank you for framing that. And that is true. We're both looking at MITRE ATT&CK. We're both using that framework, talking about threats to our system, and we're both looking at the adversary TTPs that are found within ATT&CK, and the value that language can bring using that as a common language and as a central part of the approach. We talked a little bit in question one about bringing different groups together and having that common language, that common way of talking about things, and how that applies to threat modeling. And this is just another piece of that process.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, please go ahead.
Actually, before we go on, I realize we're getting a little jargony because I think that people might not necessarily use the language of TTPs. Do you want to talk
Okay.
about that for a second?
About TTPs, sure.
Yeah, and how they relate to the common graphical view of attack that a lot of people are familiar with.
Yeah, absolutely. So in MITRE ATT&CK, we have these concepts of tactics and techniques. TTP stands for tactics, techniques, and procedures. It's abbreviated to TTPs. And these are found within attack. They are part of this language that we use in the attack framework to talk about adversary behaviors. Tactics are sort of that high level adversarial goal. What is the adversary trying to gain? Are they trying to escalate their privileges? Are they trying to evade defenses? So these are the larger goals that the adversary has. Those are the tactics. And under these tactics are various techniques. So what are the specific things an adversary is doing in order to achieve those goals? What types of techniques are they employing? It can be things such as phishing, which may be harder to detect. Um, but are they phishing? Are they using some sort of social engineering? What types of techniques are they using to gain that goal? Are they trying to gain credentials? Are they using a valid account technique, perhaps? Um, are they looking across systems to see what they can find? Are there clear text passwords that are being stored? Are they just spraying passwords? Is it brute force for them to try and get it right? There's all these various ways that adversaries can go about achieving their goals and the various techniques they use. And also within attack, you can find examples of the specific procedures that the adversaries are using, specific groups. So, various threat groups that are out there, the different threat actors. What specific procedures, what specific techniques have they used? So when we talk about attack, it's a catalog in a sense of these behaviors. And it not only gives these behaviors a name, but also gives them each a unique identifier. And that helps us to talk about things in a way where everyone knows what we're talking about. It's that common language, that common ground. And, again, as we talked about, different groups may evaluate those techniques or tactics differently. They may look at them from a different approach, whether it be a policy implementation or a patch that needs to be applied to certain software, but it gives that common ground.
And one of the things you said in there that I just want to spotlight for a second is you talked about the attacker's high level goals of elevating privileges or stealing a password. And a lot of people, there's a fellow, Dominique White, has this lovely phrase. He says, "We don't have to be our attackers' psychologists." Um,
It's
and
true.
some people want to talk about the really high level goals of, we're going to steal money, we're going to influence politics in this country by increasing divisiveness on social media. We're going to steal military secrets, right? Whatever those higher level goals are, those are really hard
Hmm.
to tie to a particular technical system or a feature of a technical system. And so thinking about those goals leads people scratching their heads saying, how could they do that? I don't get the connection. But if we talk about the goals as persistence, right? The
Hmm.
attacker who has gotten in wants to be able to come back next month and still get in. we can think about, okay, if you're persisting on my iPhone, I'm going to reboot it. If you're persisting in my AWS environment, I'm going to use Phoenix builds that we burn down on a weekly basis and replace with a new one out of our CI/CD pipeline.
Mm.
And you got into AWS, well, whoop-de-doo, we kick you out at the end of the week.
Right.
And
Right.
so I think it's really nice to hear you talking about attacker goals at that sort of level of abstraction that's broad enough that we can vary up how it might work, broad enough how we might respond to it, but still have consistency in a way that as we bring those people in who might not know every specific attack, every specific procedure that every attacker group can use, can grasp that sort of abstracted, okay, the attacker wants to persist.
Hmm.
I,
Yeah.
I, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's true. It is abstracted at that level because we're not trying to understand their motive, um, or anything like that. We're just trying to understand what is the tactical goal right now.
And the motive thing, if I can continue here, because this is a
Yeah.
place that I see a lot of folks fall down, is this, why would they ever do that? The question of why would someone do this isn't one we need to answer to defend our systems effectively.
It's an excellent point. We don't need to understand.
And that's one of the things that I think is so interestingly useful about using attack for this, is it's got details that really do, to borrow a phrase, inform defense, um, without getting into stuff that doesn't necessarily help us do that.
Mm.
Should we talk about how we actually do this?
I think that would be great, because there are different approaches that can be taken. Of course, we're talking about evidence-based analysis, as one, and that's what has happened before. Um, what has happened?
Mm-hmm.
Um, what has happened to similar systems? What have attackers used as methods of attack, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also a little bit about the theoretical approach, and when we're talking theoretical, again, we're not trying to understand their motives, but we're trying to understand more at that tactic level. In theory, what is it that they could be doing? Could they be covering their tracks or innovating defenses? Um, could they be installing a backdoor on a system? Um, things like that. So would you like to get into that a bit more?
Sure. And I'm gonna start with sort of the greenfield approach, right? When you're working on something that's new,
Hmm.
we can use the tactics to think about, if we build our system like this. And I like to think about, if we go back to the weirdly now classical Lockheed chain, it starts with reconnaissance, it continues into exploit discovery and weaponization and then delivery. And I tend to start around the delivery phase. How is someone going to deliver an attack into this
Hmm.
system? And this is close to thinking about attack surfaces. It's not
Hmm.
precisely the same,
Sure.
but we can think about, where is an attack going to get delivered?
Hmm.
What is it going to attack? How does it exploit it? Then, having gone through the exploit stage, what does it install? What's the next step? And we can think about those things in a very open ended way.
Hmm.
And when we do that, it leads us to start thinking about, let's write those parsers more defensively, right? Let's make sure that the code that we have at those delivery points is properly defensively coded.
Mm-hmm.
It lets us think about boundaries. Okay, let's constrain this so that if an attacker does get in, there's
Mm-hmm.
something that's going to stop them. Maybe we run these things as immutable AWS agents, or we run them as lambdas, which should have no side effects. And so we can get defenses built into what we're working on in ways that are incredibly powerful. And that was my approach to using attack, was to treat the tactics at a very high level and use them to inform all up design.
Mm-hmm.
And your approach, I'm tempted to try and explain your approach, but I think you'll do a better job, unless you'd like me to make mistakes so you can correct me.
Yeah, so with our approach, and again the diagram that we talked about, question one, of course, is so helpful with either approach, right? Because now we can look across this diagram, we can look across the system components, the data flows, and we can brainstorm, right? The types of attacks, and I say that little attack and also miter attack, attack TTPs that can be used, right, to attack those components. And gathering those ideas, looking at that diagram, gathering ideas from the attack matrix, um, to select the types of techniques that an adversary um, previously used against that type of platform. Attack, MITRE ATT&CK has this concept of platforms, so you can look at it that way. Um, or also, what in theory could happen. What has happened in what types of things have adversaries tried to achieve that's similar to your system, or the type of data that's housed by your system or on your network. And once you've got that list developed, of theoretical versus evidence and those types of adversaries' behaviors, that's when you're building that picture of what could go wrong, right? And we're really trying to build out that picture of, here's your system, here's what we're working on, not what we're building, here's what we're working on. Here are the types of things that could happen to it. Here are the things that could go wrong. And that's starting to build this foundation, for the next question, which would be, what are we going to do about it?
And one of the things you said in there, I think, is really, really powerful, which is what is happening to other similar systems.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the problems that we can run into is there's just so many things that could go wrong. How do we prioritize them?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's, especially as we get to operational systems that are going to be fielded rather than the components, being able to say, this is really happening in the world today. Wendy Nather has this concept of the security poverty line, where you can't even defend against the things that are known to be happening.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that constraining that set to say, you really do need, it's 2025, you need to be defending against bot signups in your app, because of this or that, or you need to be defending against password brute forcing, whatever the answer is. Having insight into your industry, healthcare, banking, is targeted, utilities are targeted by these specific groups using these specific tactics today, can give us a really powerful operational answer to where do we start, right? Until we're dealing with the stuff that the known threat groups are engaged in today, some of these other questions, which I don't love the term theoretical, but I'm going to go with less immediate.
Okay.
um, the stuff that the things and we're filming this in January of 2025. The fires are still going in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
um, I'm not going to tell anyone that when their house is threatened by a raging fire, they should be doing anything but fire prevention.
Right. Right. That prioritized approach. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And so yeah, and we do, in the center project, we do talk about theory versus evidence. And theory are the ones with that potential, right, to impact the system, where
Mm-hmm.
evidence is that documented threat against other systems. But as you mentioned, it's not just looking at other similar systems. It's also looking within your sector, right? So the financial sector will have different threats than perhaps the restaurant industry. So it's just understanding your environment and understanding the threats to your environment.
And
Um,
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and for sure, taking that prioritized approach, um, and what's happening in the now. The fire analogy is excellent because dealing with that fire, that's your top priority, and everything else can wait.
And there's one other, having said, fight
Mm-hmm.
the fire before you do anything else.
Mm-hmm.
There's one other important part of prioritization that I think is worth, although we might be verging into the question of what are we going to do about it,
Mm-hmm.
but I'll keep this on the what can go wrong side. If you have places where you know that it's going to be hard to make a change later, thinking about what can go wrong in those places is very, very high value.
Yeah.
The example I tend to use is API design, right? If your API, and especially if your API is used by other software to do integrations, it's very hard to change that.
Mm-hmm.
So, an example that I lived is the string copying APIs in Windows were, like the ones in Unix, vulnerable to buffer overflows. They couldn't make a change to how those APIs worked because there were literally billions of places that they were called, written by literally over a million software designers.
Wow.
So they created new APIs, stir safe APIs that are designed to be used safely,
Mm-hmm.
um, and encouraged the whole world to rewrite their code. That project, I think, it's been a long time since I worked there. That project, as far as I know, is probably still ongoing. And so if you're designing an API, and by the way, when I say ongoing, I mean ongoing 18 plus years now. Um, and so if you can focus your attention, if what are we working on as an API someone else is calling,
Mm-hmm.
if it's a security user experience that we want to get right from the get-go to reduce the odds of phishing and reduce the pain of retraining human beings as we make a new version of it,
Mm-hmm.
we should think about what can go wrong and the theoretical possibilities might be not might be should be prioritized a little bit differently than the theoretical possibilities in areas where it's easier to make changes.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's important. and talking about this prioritization or this scoring, um, it's not going to apply across. We can't, we can't say use this score, for this technique, because it's going to be environment dependent. It's going to be system dependent, and really, you know, looking at theoretical and looking at evidence based. You may, depending on your situation, your environment, you may want to weight those differently, um, and come up with your own factors that you apply. You can look at things like, for example, a theoretical one. Is it something that was, mentioned as a possibility? Was it mentioned in a research paper? Um, or, is it something that is associated with a CVE that is applicable to your platform that perhaps you have left unpatched for some reason? Um, or, when talking about different sectors and your industry, going, more on the evidence side, is this something that a particular threat group that's targeting your industry, is it something that they're using and actively using? That might be something, that you want to look at a little more closely. Or um, is it something that's been actually used against your platform in the past, or targeting your organization in the past? So these are the types of things to consider when looking at what could go wrong and looking at how to prioritize those threats. And this all goes into that threat informed approach.
So this is interesting to me because usually my advice to people is when we're thinking about the question of what can go wrong, don't prioritize at all. Only prioritize once we start to get into foreshadowing. Uh, sorry.
That's okay.
Once we get into the question of what are we going to do about it, because that's the thing we're prioritizing, is we're prioritizing our response to that thing. And one of the things I'm enjoying about this conversation is that we have different perspectives on when do we do this. We can
Mhm.
plug things differently.
Mhm.
And the thing I want our listeners to take away is not I agree with Adam or I agree with Tiffany, but in my situation, I should do it like this because, right? We can
Right.
play with the answers. We can move blocks around. Um, and being able to do that is part of having a mature, well developed process where you're
Mhm.
doing these things not because Adam or Tiffany or Nis said to.
Mhm.
You're doing these things because you see that doing them helps you develop products better, faster, more securely
Absolutely.
than some of the alternatives.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's an excellent way to summarize that, summarize the differences, and summarize why, um, they're both they're both valid approaches. All right. So Adam, with that, I think that was a great discussion about what could go wrong, and how to go about answering that question, for your own environment. Um, so I would say let's wrap with that for question two. And we will start our next installment, with question three. What are we going to do about it? So to our viewers, be sure to check back for that. Adam, um, would you like to tell us what you have coming up in the future?
So I'm going to stick in the past for right now, if I may,
Oh, yeah, sure.
because for
Yeah.
this question, you and I and a lot of people that we work with really did learn about threats by apprenticeship. And
We
it was
did.
when I was delivering training, somebody came up to me at a break and said, Adam, where do I learn about these threats you're talking about? And I had some answers for him, but I didn't like any of my answers. And so I wrote the book, Threats: What Every Engineer Should Learn from Star Wars, which is all about how I think about threats. And it covers both stride and kill chains. And if you
Hmm.
want to dive deeper into this question, um, it's available where fine books are sold.
Yeah, and an excellent resource to learn more.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Adam.